Hey there, Banditos. Welcome to the Friday episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. I'm Mike Farah, and no, you're not seeing things. It is me. 2 episodes in a row. Glad to be here. I'm glad that we have Josh Blaylock on the program. You may know Josh as the creative force and founder of Devil's Due Studios, that publishing house that really brought back kind of licensed comics in a big way about 20 years ago with G.I. Joe and Voltron, but also has done a number of creator-owned projects there, including Mercy Sparks, including Arc World, and now the Disavowed, which is a bit like a take on G.I. Joe, really, but kind of in the real world. Kid of one of the members of this squadron is just discovering his dad was a member, and it really goes off on an interesting, sort of skewed G.I. Joe adventure from there. So let's get into it. Let's hear more from Josh. This is Josh Blaylock. Mr. Josh Blaylock. Josh, how are you?
Great. Thanks for having me.
We, as I said, are very excited to have you. We're going to kick you off with the first question we ask all our guests, which is, how did you first discover comics?
First Discover comics.
Yeah.
They would have been laying around the house, probably before I even really could read. My dad just always had like Conan comics laying around. I think sometimes maybe the Incredible Hulk or Thor. So that would have been like he wasn't the first. That he wasn't like a huge collector, but it was not like something weird to have in the house. And then I really grabbed onto them though and started religiously reading them though with the GI Joe comic series when I was about 8 years old.
And were you a collector right off the bat, or do you have any of those original like GI Joes or the ones that were laying about the house?
Yeah. Sadly I don't have those anymore, but I have my I got in I was like every kid reading about playing with the toys, reading the watching the cartoon and then came across the book at like a 7-Eleven spinner rack or something and it just felt so much more adult and serious and just blew my mind. So I begged for that, got to take that home, and then was hooked. Then from there, I got sucked in like to superhero comics through like the DC route with the Michael Keaton Batman movie, and then reading all the Frank Miller stuff and Alan Moore and just stuff I had no business reading when I was like 12 years old. Um, and uh, and that kind of made me into a bit of a DC superhero nerd. But I also got into like the the TMNT comics, which sent me down sort of an indie comic, black and white comic rabbit hole. And that sort of like weird mix of everything shaped my comic book history. But I was always drawing like from literally I can't remember not drawing. I was like 2 years old. I think I my parents said I was drawing, and I was always though not for the just the sake of drawing. I always wanted to tell a story with the drawings. So that's why like comics is kind of like the only medium I mean that I was like put on the earth for is it's I've got to be drawing with a story that's going along with it.
And did you know from that early age that that's what you were going to do with your life?
Um, I had this weird obsession with I when I was like 4 or 5, I wanted to be an animator. I didn't have the vocabulary, but I was trying to explain I need to draw cartoons that are on the
Cartoons. Yeah.
TV, and I could like because they all thought I meant like comic strips in the newspaper, and I was like, no, the ones that move on TV. Um, and then so I got really serious about that when I was really like about I don't know like 9 or 10. I was writing letters to Disney asking how to do that, but the whole time I'm just drawing comic books, and realized when I was around like 12, like wait, this is what I really want to do. Like kind of a cog in the wheel doing animation unless you get lucky enough to be one of those main character designers or something. And then just started really seriously pursuing figuring out how to break into the industry in sometime like the end of middle school, beginning of high school, and then started self-publishing when high school ended.
And was it always the case that you trying at that point to, I guess, use your self-publishing to eventually get to one of the larger publishers, or did you always have it in the back of your mind that you wanted to kind of go your own way?
Oh, I definitely wasn't planning on like being a self-publisher and then later on like running a whole publishing company. I was like sending submissions and like a lot of comic book artists, like have the story of sending really terrible art samples in, when I'm like 13 or 14 to DC and Marvel and say, trying to get hired and every now and then they would write, actually write you back like some pointers or words of encouragement, which was really cool. And then when I was around like 14 is when all the guys left Marvel to start Image Comics.
Mhm.
And that was just like the hottest thing in the world, which made me, having been this huge Disney nerd, so, reading Disney biographies in like seventh and eighth grade, and then for the Image stuff to happen really set me on a path of kind of wanting to create my own little world, like not just like character world, but like my own little business world, my own little studio, something like that. But I still thought, I'll I'll get a deal with somebody, and I was still trying to get hired by people. And uh but like, the path sort of took me in a different direction because I ended up, you know, having some really big opportunities that just like kind of rocketed the company from nothing after several years to, this major studio and then here I am 20 plus years later, still doing that. And now I'm like, after publishing probably nearly like 1,000 books over the years, I'm kind of trying to get back to being a studio and focusing on more on my own creations and working with other publishers again.
Got it. Well, let's go back before that sort of transition in maybe from business to creative, or the transition back to that, and starting the Devil's Due publishing company. What were the seeds of that founding that company?
Um, this is a big difference. It took me years to like sort of like realize that, as obvious as it is. It was just all of my business decisions definitely came from that creative desire. So it was all either lack of patience, or the desire for autonomy, and just wanting to get stuff out there. Whereas sometimes when people start a business, they literally go into the mindset of like, I'm starting a business. What would be a good business opportunity and ways
Hmm,
to make money? And oh, I happen to like comic books. Maybe I could start a comic book company. And that's probably a better way to do it. It's sometimes because but if you're a creator, a lot, I was fortunate enough, I guess, to have the business sense, to not feel like I needed to wait for anybody. But a lot of that came from like the time, this was like the mid 90s. I lived in Cincinnati, Ohio. I also lived in like kind of a quieter part of Florida, part of the time as a kid. And yeah, there weren't any Comic Cons around that were like big deal cons. There was no like little opportunity there. The internet was pretty new. So um if you wanted to put it out there, you just had to get in the car and go to the shows and just you had to produce something to get nationally distributed and get noticed. So I was just I'd say doing that out of lack of patience, making my own books. And then I was supposed to get I actually had a deal for a book that was going to come out with this like indie publisher from a long time ago. I was going to do this black and white book. So right as high school graduated, I was still going to go to an art school, but I had this comic book deal lined up and I was just ready to go. And then that fell through sort of after we had the deal, and I had all the book like material ready to go. I said, I'm just going to self publish it then. I've already been spending the last like couple of years asking everybody I could who publishes already, how do you do this? How do you get this distributed? It wasn't that complicated. It wasn't easy, but it was simple, and got that done. And that was like '96. So I put out several issues of a few different titles, and in the interim, like I fell into a day job a couple years later, which was overseeing art direction and contributing to business development for a t-shirt licensing company. And I got to spearhead this whole retro line called Old School, which was bringing back 1980s nostalgia pop culture properties. And it blew up like it was in Hot Topic and Gadzooks and all these like, late 90s, early 2000s type stores. And it was a new thing. Like no one had ever done it before, which is why it was such a hit. So then I just said, wait a minute, this has been proven a success now, and now I know how to write licensing pitches. Um, um, Maybe I can do this for a comic book. I said, shit, I'm gonna go for GI Joe. I I loved all GI Joe, Transformers, Thundercats, Voltron, He Man, all that stuff. GI Joe was one I knew really well, and also it had been pretty much dead for like several years. Whereas like Transformers, for example, never left the TV screens.
Right.
In some incarnation, it was still going on, and like it actually happened, and I got the license. So in the mix of all that is Devil's Due being formed. I had a company first called Labyrinth Studios, which later on was just too clunky of a name for people to be able to spell or pronounce. And Devil Do sounded cooler. It didn't really mean anything. It just sounded cool. And I was using that as then my name on my freelance studio, just doing like commercial art projects and illustration gigs. And my plan was, oh, I'm gonna probably, keep self-publishing stuff for the next like 5 years or so, and finally something will hit. If not, one of my friends will probably have a break, and then another friend, and eventually will somebody will be able to, we'll all help each other come up at some point. And then the little gamble worked on getting that Joe license. Um, so then I did a deal with Image Comics to like go ahead and publish it through them, and then that was like a huge hit. So that took the majority of comic shops by surprise, because even though people had been coming into their shops for the last 2 years wearing all the T-shirts that I got to be involved in, they still weren't like ready to do an '80s retro thing. So, but meanwhile, in like anybody who was around then knows what an important thing Wizard magazine was for hyping new projects every year. There are
Yep.
all these fanfic, like what if fantasy articles about the '80s cartoon stuff coming back, and um, you know anybody below like 25 years old was constantly thinking about that, and we were the first to do it. So it it worked, and that was a hit and put us on the map. And then from there, I did. Oh well, we also were able to snag the Voltron rights, but then it was a feeding frenzy. Everybody going for '80s comic property rights, and did GI Joe for 7 years. Put out I think somewhere around like 4,000 pages of comics. It was about as many. It was about as much as Marvel did actually. And we did all kinds of licenses: Dungeons and Dragons, Family Guy, Child's Play, um, Chucky. Yeah, I mean, so to Child's Play. It broke a lot of new independent creators like Tim Seeley's Hack Slash. Had a lot of my own indie projects because I came from that weird indie background. I
Right.
was into like the black and white TMNT books, and I was self-publishing all my own black and white stuff, and then my own color stuff later. So um, I never really came into it with like a whole fantasy like I'm gonna draw Batman my whole life. That was never something I really aspired to. And yeah, then here I am now, years later. We've had our ups and downs. Been around for over 20 years. Uh, for several years, I did a lot of almost specifically all creator-owned titles with different people. And coming out of COVID, really just decided to try to focus as much as possible just on my own books.
How important was it when you started the company and when you first got that GI Joe license to not be necessarily swept up in that world, even though that was sort of your bread and butter at that point, that you always, trying to keep one foot in the indie comics or creator owned world?
Um, it was I always had the intention of not getting over, not being too reliant on that, but there was just no way to avoid it to some extent. I mean, we had so many licenses, and we did that book for 7 years. It definitely becomes part of your life. It was the majority of my adult life at the time. But if you think about it, one of the craziest things was how we were never late on books. And by then, after a few years, the office is, about a dozen people, almost everybody in their 20s, except for a few people. And we were working our asses off. Almost every title was licensed. So it's so much harder to do a licensed book than it is just to do any other kind of comic book. And we're all, just still a bunch of like partying 20 somethings. But we were there and we were super serious about running this like a real business and getting all the books out on time and applaud everybody, who was there during that era. Um, but it's tough, I mean, it was a different industry at the time too. Like in the top, if you go back and look at the top 300 books, I think the lowest 300 sold somewhere around like 800 copies or something like that. And the whole landscape of the top publishers was completely different. Sometimes we were very frequently, we were like in the top 10, usually in the top 10, definitely in the top 10 if you take out like the magazine companies and stuff. A couple
Right.
times we were like top five. Um, but it was just a different industry. And we kind of like, even though Dark Horse and Now and a lot of these older companies had done licensing, Devil Do kind of is sort of responsible for like it's like sort of like shaping the way the industry is now, where every single like medium-sized small publisher has licenses, and
Yeah.
that's like one of the foundational parts of their business. And then they have create their own stuff, and then they have their own company, own material. Uh, it really was probably the first one like it. And now it's funny because now I'm like just a tiny studio, but in the industry is like that's just how it runs now. Like that's how everything is. Um, I think
Yeah.
I got off track there a little bit, but that's
No, that's okay. You
yeah,
started sort of the modern version of licensed comics, which has now sort of taken off and become, if not, I mean, definitely not the whole business, but quite a large chunk of it and really kind of a powerhouse part of the industry.
yeah. I think what we, in hindsight, like one thing we should have done was just really stuck to some original titles. Like there's books that I'd canceled because they were selling, under 10,000 copies, and uh, I could have just cut the rates on what it cost to make them. I could have kept them coming out, could have done things like that, and just ran the course of it of like eating the cost until we got over that point of being able to do collected editions and
Hmm.
omnibus books and all that, and it would have worked. But I mean, hell, omnibus collections weren't even really that much of a thing back then either. I
No,
mean,
no.
Dave Sim was always famous for having what they call them the service phone books. There was people didn't even really use the word omnibus for those. The um, I think it was like the Forgotten Realms and GI Joe versus Transformers, Voltron, and then Hack Slash really helped popularize those big, thick omnibus collections that you know are like I still do them now. I'm in their gold. They're like people love to binge. That's the best way. I think I get more readers for my book Mercy Sparks than anything from the omnibus books.
Yeah. Um, so you've mentioned that you've now been at this, more than 20 years. Um, and you've already referred to some of the changes, but what would you say the biggest, I guess, change has been since you started? Given that the industry has probably changed a lot since you started.
Um, it's the industry now is a lot more in line with like my personal like natural way of doing things, and it's I resonate with it more, and it's a little more disruptive. It's a lot more disruptive. But the biggest difference is like most entertainment medium, most different entertainment media. It was a there was a very much clearer path on how you're supposed to do things, how the industry ran. There was a way of doing things. There were gatekeepers, and you had to break through those barriers to do that. And then, if you did that, then you were pretty much, had a place. So that would be, it was a lot harder to print. Um, you had to spend a lot more upfront to get a book printed. But there was a couple distributors, and then very quickly there was one distributor. You just had to get in there to get solicited, and then there was a nice small group of magazines, and then a small group of websites later that they're pretty much, if you got listed in them, everyone would at least know sort of who you were.
Right.
The barrier was getting them to talk about you, and from there, it was just up to you and how long you were ready to stay in the game. And now there's no barrier to entry. It's more like, there's no excuse. If you want to make comic books, start posting your comic on Webtoon or something. You can fund your stuff on Kickstarter, and there. It's so much easier to just do it, and it's actually now like, if you're not just doing it, then it's almost like you must not be serious.
Right.
Um, but a lot harder to get noticed, a lot harder to not get buried by everything else going on. So that's the biggest shift. Still, like, the cream rises to the top, and um, there's still a place. You just have to be more flexible, and you can't. I think if you feel like things are supposed to be done a certain way, and they if they don't, they're not done that way. That's not real comics, or it's not right. Then you're gonna have a really hard time. That's just, it's not gonna it's not gonna get any simpler. It's gonna keep it going in that direction. You kind of have to, everybody's kind of carving their own path, even people who've been doing this for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's a double-edged sword, right? That things have become a lot more democratized, and there's, like you said, a lower barrier to entry. But because of that, there also is a lot of competition for readership and eyeballs. And that's in addition to screens, movies, TV, prose books, everything else that's competing for eyeballs. And I can imagine that that is probably a larger challenge, maybe even than some of the, even getting in. It's getting people to, give of themselves to try to find your and read your books.
Yeah, you're asking them to give up their time versus all these other options that they have to read your stuff. And
Yeah.
but I, so I'm, not to shill this book because it's not ready to shill yet, but I'm working on a new update to my how to self-publish comics book. I did a book going back, hell, 18 years now, but it's been updated as recently as, I think, 2021. How to self-publish comics, not just create them. And it was just all about the business side of it, and a lot of stuff we've been talking about here. But things have changed so much just since like 2020. Um, just going off of what people are asking me about these days, I'm going to do a 40-page update pamphlet called "Just Breaking into Comics: No More Rules." And this, the whole thing is just whatever you were told before is kind of like out the window. On the business side,
Right.
creatively, there are plenty of amazing resources, more than ever. You can go learn great stuff, and not much of that has changed. But the yeah, it's just, you're you're asking. I've kind of forgot where I was going to go with that, but you're asking them to like give up their time. And oh, what I was bringing that up is because part of it is I'm just looking at the data. I keep up with that stuff as it is, but now I'm really digging into it and testing some of my own, or challenging some of my own hypotheses there. And it's more people than ever are reading comic books. Like, it's every time you look at the data, it's just so contradictory because everyone feels like the industry is in complete disarray, but more people than ever are reading the medium, and it keeps growing. And it's and then if you think back, if you've been in this industry for a long time, every 5 years, comics is dead. I mean, there's just you can just go back and find the articles, and then when you run out of Google searches, go find the old print magazines. Everyone's always talking about how comics is dying, and it's just it's always feels that way. And then yeah, but it's crazy, man. I mean, we've got so many people that have come in, not just readers, but hundreds of creators that came in with the manga wave in the early 2000s that then became part of the whole like image creator owned boom, aftershock, all like resurgence in the 20 early 20 teens, mid 20 teens. And then I think we're about to have another wave of that again. Uh, and then this time we also have like all these kids from the 2010s who were reading Dogman and Captain Underpants and Smiles. They aged up into manga. They're getting older now. They're starting to look for other stuff. You're gonna start seeing more influences coming in from that into like these hybrids of, is this a manga or is this a standard Western comic? We can't tell anymore. This is just like an American comic book. And are you going to buy it on a webtoon? Are you going to read it on a webtoon? Are you going to buy it on Kickstarter? Are you going to buy it at the comic book shop, bookstore? It's just going to be kind of everywhere now. So it was nice, and it's a little like nostalgic to think back on when like, oh, you want a comic book, you go to the comic book shop, and if you can get them to buy it, you're good.
Right. Yeah, I feel like if there are two constants in the comic book world, one is that there's always doom and gloom, it's always dying. And at the same time, it's always evolving. There's always a different format, there's always a resurgence of different properties. There's always a, indie revolution. So, you know, I think that's just part and parcel of people working and doing their thing in the industry. And it's just always, you're always going to have the naysayers and you're always going to have the people that are just doing the work and
Yeah.
really evolving the industry.
Maybe it's because all the stories we read in comics are just about the end of the world and having to overcome these like
That's true.
crazy odds.
So I wanted to turn to your creator-owned work because, as you said, you've been doing a lot more of that in recent years, and we're going to talk about the new one that's on the horizon, the Disavowed. But I also wanted to talk about, some of your other recent books that you've been doing, Mercy Sparks and Arc World. Just in general, where do these ideas come from? Are they, do some of them you have in your back pocket you've been developing for a while, or some of them just come to you in dreams or off the street? Like, where do you get your ideas?
Um, Usually they come from outside interests and something that like grabs my imagination, and then I start to go down rabbit holes of learning about it, and then I'm like, oh, I have to tell a story about this. Um, and Mercy Sparks though was one that was really, I mean, it was the first book came out in 2008, so it's actually 16 years old now, and it has come out kind of sporadically, but it's been collected into nice, easy to consume editions and still continues. That's about a devil girl that works for heaven hunting rogue angels. So she does heaven's dirty work. It's sort of like no one's really supposed to know has to get done to keep things clean. And that was really just I was at a convention a couple years before that. Appropriately enough, if you've read the book for the character, like I was kind of hungover, just sketching, like entertaining myself. I drew this like devil girl. She was twirling a halo in her finger and had a big feather in her mouth, and like she just got in a fight with an angel. And then just started thinking about what the idea behind this character could be, and it was literally almost every element about it was an antithesis to just kind of say fuck it to all of the like very heavy activity we'd had in Hollywood back then. Everything that was being requested of us, for all of these like grounded comic book pitches that could be more serious and turned into films. And I was like, I just need something that I could, if I do draw it, I'll never get bored drawing it. I'll never get bored writing it. And it's just crazy. And every time I catch myself being like, oh, I don't think this could be in a movie, then I'd stop myself. Like, doesn't matter. This is fun. And that's what the book became. And ironically enough, that's like the number one property I've had the last couple of years in Hollywood. Now, it's out there on the market again, but it's been pretty good with that the last couple of years. So yeah, and then
Was there
it,
anything in the back of
right.
your head, like thematically, devils do?
Um,
I should do some sort of devil
you
character.
know, it's funny. I'm like, I don't think people even believe me when I'm like, it doesn't mean anything. Now I'm consciously going back and I'm like, no, we're gonna do books that look like they come from a company that would be called Devils Do. Like that's because I mean, I'll get on a tangent. I'll just get into something like, you know, I'll want to explain something, like I did a thing called the Bitcoin Comic Handbook, which was all about explaining technology beyond money and
Yeah.
what it meant. And I did that in like 2017, 2018. Um, and it's just half prose, half comic strips. I've done political like anthologies, and you know, did a graphic novel on the Armenian genocide. And it's like, okay, I'm going to try to really stick to supernatural, high concept sci-fi, kind of like dark humor wheelhouse. And then if something else like that pops up again, like the educational stuff, I can still do that, but I need to find somewhere else to do that.
Mhm.
I'm gonna do that, the Breaking in the Comics book, Do Devils Do, just that there's always such a history already with the how-to book, and it's been in print for forever. But uh, when I'm working on that though, really like it's heavily inspired by different like music subcultures, mostly punk rock and goth stuff, but definitely also some hip hop, like the indie scene. And when I'm explaining the visuals to any artist I'm working with, that stuff's always really important. It's almost in my head, like when I'm writing it, I will catch myself like just watching lots of music videos on YouTube, like in the background, and it's it's kind of like I think of the visuals in terms of like directing a music video. Um, you know, like when I want to explain something, like if I was when I'm working with like a movie producer who was asking for more reference or something, I'm always like, for the Angels, it was like, here's 5 links to different videos. This is exactly what I'm thinking. And how they would appear in the real world. Stuff like that. Um, Other stuff like Arc World is like my love letter to like fascination with like lost ancient advanced civilizations, and you know uh I call it archaeopunk. um Instead of just like, for example, like instead of just telling a story about Atlantis and it's underwater and it's all fish people or something, it's like, no, let's take like some of the mysteries of the pyramids and all these ancient structures, the stuff that really can't be explained, that we just don't know, and say, okay, well, what if there was this civilization and it was advanced in a different way? How would the science work and all that? And you think about that the way that with steampunk, you're actually trying to come up with a way. What if everything had evolved through, pneumatic tubes and hydraulics and stuff? How might that work? That's kind of like the thought there, and just something fun, and fill it with all kinds of Easter eggs where people can go look at like the real monuments and relics that inspired the sci-fi story. Um, and then I just had a natural love of just theorizing about like where the future may be going with technology and everything too. So when it comes to books like The Encoded, it's just like all 100% inspired by where the convergence of technologies might be going. And it's still an action sci-fi book, so The Encoded is about what happens with an AI singularity when it achieves super intelligence. But what if it doesn't try to kill us, but it also doesn't try to help us? It's like it instantly, within a second, so disinterested in us and so much smarter than us, it just bounces. It doesn't even say hello, and that drives us crazy. And then we start causing it problems, and then the people like Neo or like John Connor, those guys are actually kind of like misguided zealots trying to like antagonize this thing that means us no harm, and then it bites us, and we're dealing with like the aftermath of like 20 years later in the 2050s. Um, so that's kind of like a Minority Report meets The Purge, because they have to keep the modern privileges of a high advanced society in the 2050s. If we want to keep using artificial intelligence and augmented reality and everything, they to keep it from going rampant, they have to randomly just shut the whole grid down without warning sometimes. So suddenly things become like it's like 1989, like before the internet, and everyone just kind of has to know how to handle themselves. And that's and then we I throw in Android assassins and and
Of course.
lots of fun. So um yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
inspiration comes from everywhere. It's more like I don't know. It's more like how do you decide which ideas to do? Like ideas are
Right.
like flowing every day.
Well, it sounds like, the thread that runs through the ones you've just talked about are maybe taking something that's kind of sort of familiar, in terms of like a maybe not a theme, but like a setting or an environment or a trope or something, and putting a different angle on it. Like what you're just talking about with the AI that you've seen kind of this story before in terms of what AI can do, but what if you look at it from the AI's perspective, or that these people that are trying to stop it are, the antagonists, and have caused something that they're trying to either prevent or fight. So, finding a little bit of that familiar, which can, ground, I think, a reader, and then putting something new and original on it is I really like that idea.
Cool. Yeah, it's always funny because when you finally extrapolate what the themes are, it's so simple and so painfully obvious. Like, the creator, it's almost like embarrassing where I do when you said you bringing that up, I do remember when I had this realization of one common theme, which Mercy Sparks has this. Before that, this book I did called Core has this about a guy who gets possessed by this ancient monster that's like not if Lucifer is God's son, this is the equivalent to like God's uh, brother, but evil, and is immediately like everyone's worried about it. He's too powerful, and he's thrown into another world where their magic has like run out, and he's a pure source of magic. But the, I'm going to take forever to tell that story, but he's thrust into this other world, and then Misplaced was another series about a girl from this like kind of retro future sci-fi realm where she had all this potential, but it was very restrictive. And then she escapes and gets dumped into my old college town I used to live in Cincinnati, Ohio, before I lived in Chicago. Um, and then I was like, oh my God, the theme of every single thing is someone gets thrust from one environment to the other, or they go to one environment to the other, and they also like kind of are seeing things differently than everyone else, and they're always kind of like the weirdo who's like, yeah, things don't really work this way though, do they? This is what's really going on. And I'm like, oh, I was a little kid, and you know,
Right.
my one parent moved to Florida, and the other was had to move to Maryland because of the military, and I was thrown on the airplane going back and forth in different schools, and then it just was like so painfully obvious that that's kind of what shaped the themes, and yeah, it's either that or it's like exactly like you pull out another one that I don't really think about that often. It's like the more the sci-fi stuff I think comes from like just kind of like looking at stuff and putting a different twist on it, and playing with where it might go.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think uh, what you're describing in the former, the sort of fish out of water or like a stranger in a strange land kind of thing is always resonant, and then having a personal connection to that theme I feel like is always helpful when you're writing something, to have, even if it's not, this is a biography of my life. It's something, you're pulling something. I think it makes it more interesting for the creator and therefore comes across to, the reader as well. So, I think that's always interesting. So that maybe a good segue to the new project, which is called the Disavowed, which I think brings a little bit of everything we've been talking about together. Um, I took a look at the 8-page preview. Uh, Definitely looks familiar. So I'd love to
I wasn't
know.
sure.
Go
I
aheed.
wasn't sure if you got the preview or if you got the whole issue.
I got the preview,
Okay.
the 8-pager, or that's what I looked at. Maybe maybe I did and I just missed it in the email. But um, tell me a little bit about the Disavowed and what you're trying to do with this book.
The Disavowed is about a top secret task force from the 1980s called the United Five, which was formed by a military, quasi corporate, quasi government funded military group to combat a terrorist slash cult called Komodo. And it's total homage and like really the first deconstruction of its kind to like total like GI Joe 80s action, saga. It's we're taken on the into the story though through the eyes of the child of through the son of one of the former team members.
Right.
Um, and then like how it's sort of he's sort of like your entry point into learning about everything that went down. And it's totally like gloves off. It's mature readers. It's we've got like there's lasers eviscerating everyone, lots of gratuitous action and debauchery and fun, and that's why they've Massive's been dubbing it GI Joe meets the boys.
Mm,
um, and but it's also like just as much. It's also channeling a lot of things were running parallel at the time. If you grew up consuming all that, you are probably also renting like VHS movies, like direct to VHS ninja films and commando type movies
yeah.
and just and some weird like 2020 Texas Gladiator cyberpunk future dystopia. Like all that but really like there were so many movies like that that we had no business watching at that age and it's just I think parents not paying at least my parents uh just kind of let me watch whatever but um and that all kind of feeds into the whole military meets ninja, you know, cornucopia that was GI Joe. Um, but yeah, it's it's it kind of came from well the real like when I really got excited about it was when I had been thinking about over the years because there was a couple times it looked like I might get involved in working on something like Joe again or whatever, but I was always or I'm just being at conventions constantly asked about it. Like, every single show, there's not someone not bringing those books to sign. It's like if there's not a hit, like a big mainstream resurgence at some point, you go too long where like a title can't be like a brand can't really come back the same way.
Yeah.
It can't evolve because and then when you've got something that was such an era of its time that has so many like sort of can get problematic, at least when it's run by like a a toy company versus an entertainment company that is concerned about parents and subject matter like military and guns and all this stuff, it just gets harder and harder to make this a four quadrant brand. Um, and I just had the thought of like, well, what if you just said fuck it? Just they're in the 80s, like just go the other way. Don't try to bring them in any further than that, and then just own that. Like, just go all
Right.
out, and like, it's not just like 80s action. They're snorting cocaine and banging each other before they run into battle. If we want to, like, it's not just that kind of like silliness, but I want to be able to do that if the moment strikes. Um, and then because 80s nostalgia itself is somehow still so popular. Like, uh, for being like the person that really helped kickstart that movement, I never thought it would last as long as it has and still be something like I would never really foresaw like Stranger Things and stuff like that still being people still being so obsessed with that era, and also not just newer audiences still being interested in that subject matter, but like Gen X just isn't going to ever stop buying stuff like this. Like, that is our it's I think that's another, just like we confused the boomers when how much we loved this stuff, still wanted it when we were 23. We still want it when we're 40 and 45, and when we're 63, we're gonna still be buying that stuff. Um, so could still keep making stories for them, and um, yeah. But then in the modern setting in the story, then it opens it up to like it's about sort of the ripple effects and the ramifications of them having existed, and raising questions like, you know, when you hear stuff about the past, it's always like more kind of like a Wild West
Right.
vibe, and then the why things are more buttoned up, or follow more or different rules now, and it's like, well, with the United Five or whatever organizations exist as remnants of them, like, why are there no more AK-47s that shoot lasers anymore? Like, it's not a thing anymore. But there's lots of other high tech stuff going on, and it all has to do with that. And uh, that's part of the fun. And there's a lot of themes that organically come into this that I can play with off of nostalgia.
It sounds to me like I'm sort of answering my own next question, which I was going to ask you whether this was a discrete story that you're looking to tell, or are you starting creating like a world where there are multiple discrete stories that can be told? And it sounds like it's the latter, that you're really thinking about all the possibilities that can happen with a sort of a real life 80s GI Joe team and the ramifications into the future. Is that a right way of thinking
Um,
about it? I mean, even if this one is like a mini series, let's say.
it's definitely like launching a huge world, um, eh, from the jump, but it's not following all those characters because you can't do that.
Of course.
So part of the fun is we're uh, actually treating this like it did exist back then. So pretend that there was a Mandela effect, and you just start hearing half the people talk about reading like Loving the United Five and the
Right.
Disavowed, back in the day, and you're like, this has always been a thing. So that means there was like 80s version of it. There was a 2000s resurgence of it. There's
Okay.
fans with like lots of opinions. So that's when you read the story takes itself more seriously than that, and it's just it exists as its own thing. But if you want to explore and play beyond that, you can, and that lets me throw in characters into the background, and have an excuse to throw them in the back of the book or online or something, and give them a little bio, and maybe we get back to them, maybe we never do. But
Right.
doesn't stop somebody else from talking about how they loved that character at one time. And um but yeah, like, uh I'm starting off with a mini series. It's gonna really, it has to set up a story. There will be some definite closure to this whole beginning story by the end of it, that will set the stage for more, depending on whichever direction we want to go. But it's like probably equally in the present day and in the past, and deals with like kind of two themes that sort of worked. one's more like fun and benign, and one is a little more serious, but they really just meshed together. Was like how this 80s nostalgia just refuses to die. It persists. And like the love of the characters persists. And it's always like the core group of characters seem to be the ones people keep going back to. Whenever they change it, they get too far away from it. It has to go back to that core group and vibe. And then the in in the real world we're dealing with this issues of the older generation refusing to pass the torch. Like I don't know if Gen X is ever going to get the torch from the senile from the oh my that does not I would didn't mean to the silent
Freudian slip.
generation. I
Yeah.
Freudian slip senile generation. The Freudian the silent generation, the boomers, when are the millennials ever going to get their chance, to run the show? Who knows? And that's not just politics. I know that's what everyone's talking about now, but it's also in corporate society and just every
Right.
facet of everything, home ownership, whatever. So it's like these elements in the story, like there's these characters that literally like won't die. They're still around. There's people in power that were in the scenes in the past that are still around controlling things. There's and the Disavowed refers to former members of both teams who later on go to work together with a common mission. It sort of ties into all this stuff, and that's where it really kind of comes together as the story goes on.
So important question because I saw at the end of the preview sort of this kind of character circle almost or pie chart of sorts
Oh yeah,
uh, with all of the, a great lineup. Um, but it's called the United Five. Why is it, if it's not a spoiler, why is it called the team called the United Five if there's more than five of
yeah.
them?
The five branches of the armed forces.
Okay.
And
Okay.
then which raises the question, what do we do about Space Force? But
Oh, yeah.
there's an
Well,
opportunity there too.
there you go. Evolution, right?
Yeah.
I see that if I'm correct, Pop Mon is the artist.
Yes, Patman is my partner and artist on the book. Um, he's he's drawing some of the best work of his career. For
I love his
anybody,
stuff.
yeah, like to this day, he's still known for Spy Boy, which he
That's what I
did
was.
like in
Yeah,
the late '90s, early 2000s, and I think his art has progressed so much since then. But I mean, I loved that book when it was out, and people still just fondly remember it. But he's more recently worked on uh, he was doing DC stuff. I know he was doing Raven, and he did some Masters of the Universe work, and
Mhm.
he kind of left comics for a couple of years, and he was kind of just getting bored with the kind of projects he was getting assigned, and had some other opportunities he couldn't pass up, and then he was just waiting for the right thing to kind of call him back, and we met. I think it might have been like through Clubhouse or something on. I can't remember. It was like during COVID when everybody was just chatting in different circles for once,
Right.
and I mentioned I was working on this, and he's like, "Yeah, this sounds like what I've been looking for." And now here we are finally. So some of the pages he's doing are just bananas. Like you've seen that one double page spread of the intro battle scene.
Yeah.
There's like another one like that in issue two that's just like even crazier. And it's yeah, it's funny because he told me he didn't really like to draw guns because the technical details. So he's like,
Mm.
he does it well, but he's like, can we minimize how many different types and stuff? And then I try to keep that in mind. But then he'll all of a sudden he draws like 80 vehicles on a double page spread. So he's not afraid to.
It's the big technology he can handle. It's the smaller handheld stuff that can be maybe
Yeah,
difficult to draw. Everybody has
yeah,
their own. We've talked to a number of artists, and everybody has, their individual challenges. Like I remember, I forgot who it was. It said horses. Like, do not give me
oh,
horses. I will never
yeah.
finish the art.
But
Um,
one thing I wish I learned a long time ago, it was like every comic book writer needs, with the first time they meet the artist, they need to say, what do you love to draw? What do you hate to draw?
Yeah.
And then after you've been working on the book for a while, like, hey, are any characters in here you just really, if you have the power to like change which characters you're using, it's like anybody in here you just can't stand drawing, anybody you are loving to draw that you wish you could get to draw more of, yeah, that kind of stuff um, will really help you out.
And we're back. Love talking to Josh. Had a really good time sort of diving into his whole journey throughout comics, how he got into them, how he found the Devil's Due, got those first licenses with G.I. Joe and Voltron, how he comes up with his own creations, including the Disavowed. And yeah, you should definitely check out that Kickstarter. We'll put it in the show notes. It's coming out like any day now. It'll get started. And that'll do it for a whole week's worth of programming from the Dollar Bin Bandits. Thank you for listening. Thank you for viewing. Thank you for rating, reviewing, subscribing, all that stuff that really supports us, gets us out to a wider audience. We want to bring these interviews to more folks that love comics, and we know you do too. So we'll see you next issue.